Thank you very much, Nitoo Das, for agreeing to have a conversation with me for this project on multi-species worlds. For those of you who don't know her, Nitoo teaches English at the Indraprastha College for Women, University of Delhi. But she's also a birder. And one place I read she's a caricaturist, which I did not know. And of course, a poet, and a very fine poet. I know at least of three of her books, but there could be more I don't know about. Boki, Cyborg Proverbs, and Crow. When I first met her in a common platform, I saw the references to bird watching and her poetry and to literature, and I was immediately thought of her as an artist who has such a kind of sensibility which relates to many of what she does. It comes together in her poetry, I felt. So, Nitoo, tell us a bit about yourself, and then we'll just talk freely and see where we go.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I remember the first time we met. It was great, actually. And we met. I met so many people who I felt, kind of taught differently and also alike. That was a wonderful time. I think that was 2018. That's a long time ago now.
2018.
Yeah, and I looked at the photographs that you sent me, and I was supposed to respond to one of the photographs in the mail you sent. And the one that really spoke to me was the one that showed seeds dominating. It was, even though it's a still photograph, you could actually I could sense the movement. It's almost like you can see the seeds growing, germinating. And this is the image that I wanted to think about, respond to in this conversation, and maybe later on as well, if we continue with this, as we continue with this project, maybe we could think about this a little more. Also, because I've been gardening for some years now. It's something that my parents used to do when I was a child, and without really thinking about it, I knew about the processes of gardening. I knew about when certain plants had to be, when you had to start the soil, when you had to think about the earthworms, when you had to think about, because this was Guwahati, and you had to think about the rains, you had to think about fertilization. And, we had this small kitchen garden. My mother used to kind of grow all sorts of vegetables there, and we also had some fruiting trees. And I think that kind of stayed with me. And even though I wasn't much of a gardener, but then in the last decade or so, in a way, it coincides with my bird watching, more or less coincides with. Again, I was always a bird watcher, but not really a bird photographer. That started around 2009, 2010. And also because in order to know birds, one has to know plants, one has to know trees, flowers, fruits. So in a way, it was something that the studying of birds and the studying of plant life or vegetation happened simultaneously. And I think kind of, it was enriching. But at the moment, to come back to a photograph, what I've been thinking about is actually not just the processes rather of growth, but also about, images or words that we usually associate with violence of a certain kind. Like people will constantly tell you, don't pluck flowers, they will cry. I remember when we were kids, we used to be told such things, don't pluck flowers. Even now, we are told there's this kind of moral idea about not plucking flowers, not picking flowers, not stealing flowers. But then, I've been thinking a lot about something that is known in gardening circles as deadheading. And without deadheading, without what is known as pinching or plucking of the plants of the almost dead flower, or even a flower that's still very much alive, you won't really help the plant to grow. The plant grows better, bushier, happier if you kind of pluck the flower, or pinch the new leaves. And this is something that has been, that I've been trying to think through, which is why I, kind of your photographs, I spoke to me. So it kind of, I responded to it immediately. It was that, and also because I've just shifted to a new flat, and earlier I had a rooftop garden where there was a lot of sunlight and plants used to grow very fast, grow from seeds very fast. And now, because the sunlight situation is very iffy here, like one balcony gets 4 hours of sunlight, another balcony gets it's different. I have to really think about different spaces, almost like there are all these geographical separations between different rooms in my flat now, because of the different plants that I have to grow. Yeah, these were the reasons that why I chose that particular image of yours, and also because it connects to ideas that I've been thinking about for a while now, particularly about gardening, but also about food, about growing food in the city, in a small balcony garden. What is it all about? This urban gardening. It's not just a hashtag on Instagram. It's something that one may be very passionately involved with.
You wrote a poem on gardening as well, entitled Gardening.
Yeah, I did.
Do you have it? Would you like to read a bit of it or all of it?
Yeah, I have it. It's a slightly longish poem, I think. No?
Yeah.
So maybe not the entire poem.
And the Crowbite is also a poem in the sense is also one of the poems in the book.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'll read the last couple of stanzas, because starting from Deadhead, because that's what I just talked about.
Yeah.
Deadhead, the still frilly edges of a bloom. No transplantation is expected, just like when I was younger, but yellowed with fluoresces, decaying until I found her. I'm this biodegradable thing testing the earth and time, spreading rhizome-like beneath her skin. There can be no companion planting here. She says this is treachery crafted in organic rage. Love, like that, is a lesson in shrinkage. That's just the last bit of the poem. There's a poem that's called Gardening as well.
So use the act of gardening very metaphorically as well.
Yeah, I was actually also, it's also about gardening.
Yes.
It is about gardening.
Yes. So I'm this idea of sensibility about nature, which a lot of your poems, I think, reflect, and a lot of your imagery reflects. So how did this come? Is it somewhere you grew up, or is it something very nascent in you from childhood, which led to the way you wrote your poetry? And you became a bird watcher?
Yeah, I just mentioned I grew up in Guwahati in Assam. And my childhood was spent, like even now, when I go back home, that's where my mother stays, where my family is. Our home is near the Brahmaputra. It's like I grew up right next to this huge river. And not just the river, because you could actually constantly see the changes through the river, the seasonal changes, and of course birds. And now there is a park, footpath, and a park near the river, on the side of the river, for safety reasons. But when we were children, it was just open, And the place where we live, it's built in such a way that even when the rest of Guwahati would be flooded, that particular area would remain dry, and people would come and see the other places which are flooded, but that particular area wouldn't be flooded. Also, there is, because we get fresh fish over there. So there is just a distance away from my home, there is this fish market where you get wholesale fish from early in the morning, so that the other markets kind of buy the fish right from the the market next to the river, and then they take it from there. These are just images of also this huge old trees and playing on the banks of the river. I know it's just nostalgia, but these are the things that kind of affected me and kind of stayed with me. And not that it's unthinking, non-critical nostalgia. It is nostalgia that is, of course, touched by various things, by anger sometimes by various other things, but it's still a kind of nostalgia that I think about the river in this particular way. And of course, everything associated with the river. I mean, you know what happens, when you grow up next to a river. I mean, it's just, I think it's a different kind of a world. Also, lots of birds that are now endangered. We used to see them just kind of roaming around. And then we get the sandbanks in the winters. It's so that the river turns its beach-like in the winters. And
Yes. It's very typical of the Brahmaputra.
yeah, you have this white sands in the winter months. I think that's it.
And these images stay with you.
Yeah, stay
So
with me.
when you describe them as nostalgia.
No, I actually have. I've used the word nostalgia, but I've also talked about this and written about it as well, about nostalgia that needs to be critical, that
Yeah.
needs to question all the time. So it's not this innocent nostalgia.
So by critical nostalgia, you mean?
It's a term that I've been using. I've used it quite frequently, especially when I'm asked to talk about the Northeast, for instance. It's this term, Northeast, a geographical category, Northeast writing, Northeast poetry, Northeast person, whatever. And I've actually used this term to talk about my, the conflicting histories of how I remember my childhood, of how I remember my past. But I think we're digressing, no? We're digressing.
No, I'm interested in this idea of critical nostalgia because I think it's I will tell you where I'm leading with this. But
Because I have used it quite often. I've not really written about it so much, maybe in an article or two. Haven't really written about it seriously, but in talks, conversations, lectures, etc., I have discussed it quite extensively, actually.
really,
Especially when I talk about looking back, remembering, reminiscing, and then it's many a time when I talk about the Brahmaputra, I think about it with happiness, perhaps, but also tinged with sadness and, like I said earlier, kind of anger.
yeah,
And it's about various things, about not having cultural capital when I was growing up, or of always somehow being on the margins of various things. So that's how this term kind of crept into my consciousness, and I've been using.
yeah. It's an unusual term, but it sort of relocates your relationship.
Yeah.
In hindsight, it relocates it in another kind of frame, which also makes it possible to re-examine it. And I think this is part of the nature question as well. It's a part of how we think of the question of nature, the world outside, the non-human or the more than human. How do we imagine it? Because it is a world outside of us, and it is an othering of another world, in a sense. And I think what you do as a poet is to have a dialogue with that othering. This is what I find in your work, and that it's a dialogical space. So the othering is fluid, and I think it reveals a relationship rather than just a polemic kind of idea of this or that. So that's why I'm thinking of you turn to be a bird watcher or a birder, as you call yourself, and a very active one. And I, of course, see it as your way of keeping that connection alive, which leads to your poetry as well from the outside. But how do you think of your birding? I mean, because for me, so many elements of you come together in your poems. Your love with literature and your idea of nature and your birding, and also your great proficiency as a poet.
Yeah. It's interesting the way you have encapsulated a certain diverse, I think, certain diverse ideas, kind of brought them together in this very interesting way. Um, See, when I think about photographing birds, not so much when I'm watching them, just watching them, but also because, looking at something in a particular way. I mean, all of us know, we have been trained in such a way now in the kind of worlds that we live in. So we know that looking at things is also it's an act of power, right? So this is something that has bothered me for quite some time. How do I look at something? How do I capture something? How do I, reframe the bird object into this photographic object? And these are things that I don't know. There's just thoughts, but sometimes when I try to put them in words, maybe just everyday prose sometimes doesn't really work so well. So sometimes I kind of use those thoughts and put them in poetry. Also because this question of othering, how do you other the object that you are looking at, the object that you are kind of reformulating. And then there are also this, especially when you're photographing something that I have been kind of been obsessing about, because you see, in bird photography, I think in a lot of wildlife photography, there is this thing that photographers go through, that they need to have this clean space in the background, and the organic, the object has to be at the center, and if not at the center, even if you're doing all this three-fourths distance and all that, it would still be in focus. It would be in focus. It would be, and the background would be blurry. It would be, the perfect bokeh, creamy bokeh, as it is called. And this is something that I have been thinking about quite a bit, because it is all photographers aspire towards that creamy bokeh. But I also want the bird to be within its habitat. I want to see the branches, the leaves. Sometimes, because the birds are moving so fast, sometimes you don't see part of the beak, you don't see part of the leg. But these things are frowned upon by good bird photographers. And this is a conflict. It's not really a conflict in me, because I know where I stand, but it's something that I kind of engage with quite often, especially via this question, and how it would work within, say, a poem. And how do you, because I don't really believe in deleting or fixing the image in such a way that the habitat is lost. The habitat of the bird is lost in the process. I mean, I believe in post-processing, so that maybe the image becomes better in a particular way, but I'm not going to change, maybe not clone out something in order to make the bird more visible, etc. These are, I think, ethical questions in photography anyway, but also because they kind of enter into questions around my poetry, which is why kind of an obsession now.
Yeah, taking this really interesting thought forward, I think, because part of the nature condition is extraction, and categorization is part of the modernist framework. That you extract, categorize, and separate. And it's also part of the colonial thinking. You take things out of context and you make them separate, as if they didn't have a context, as if the relationship did not exist, as if that individual bird exists on its own for its own visuality. And almost the image becomes that ontology of that thought. It reflects that ontology of that gaze, of how the bird watcher wants to see that image. It's beautiful, fully focused. You have these fancy lenses which blur the background, and and the better it blurs the background, the bokeh, the more expensive the lens is, in a sense. I'm very interested in this, how these images ontologically reflect the relationship we have developed with nature, and we keep on reproducing that all the time. And when you stop reproducing it, when you start creating another kinds of formats of seeing it, or another ways in which images are produced, or what the aesthetic of the image is, because the aesthetic of the image is also kind of predetermined in our reception of it.
Mhm.
So if we say, okay, another reception, another aesthetic, which is what you're pointing to, in a sense, I think this is exactly what the multi-species idea is. How do you think of the multi-species world in which human agency is not the prime agency? You have other agencies which are equally prime, and it's a shared planet in a sense. uh, I don't know if you want to react to that before I carry on, or
It's okay. You can
yeah.
carry on.
Yeah, and so I was thinking whether this reflects in the way you write, because I've heard some of your poetry on birds,
Mhm.
and you had evoked them. And if you like to recite something, if you feel like, or from that, or if you
I can
anything,
read one of my
yeah,
poems. It's
yeah,
a poem that I like. Actually. It's a brief poem, so I'm going to read the whole poem.
yes, please, that'll be great.
It's called "On the Shyness of Earth."
Mm.
Even though it's shyness, it's kind of giving a human idea
That's
of the birds are not really shy.
yeah,
But that's a birding term. They call a bird a shy bird if it's
that's
difficult to click, if you don't really
that's
see
yeah,
it. In that shiver of leaves, a certain caution lives. It is a thought as precise as suspicion. Then, inside the gaps linking rain and dawn, falls the sure cusp of song. They are not afraid, no. Every move covers the hills, navigates the clouds. There is escape, quick whip strokes in the sky, a rustle of bodies in the scrubs. But they are never here. Their songs are shadows. The leaves are shaken by visitations. The only verification is shit. So this is one of my it's I think it could be my anthem, my own personal anthem about
it's such
bird.
a yeah. You have such a you create such a visuality in your poem, And when you were reading, I was thinking of Turner's paintings on, you
Yeah,
know, and of course Turner he lived on the street.
there's this blurring
Yeah,
there are these blurry edges in Turner's work.
that's right.
I
That's
really
right.
like.
And they have the painting goes beyond the canvas always. They are
Yeah,
sort of
that goes beyond.
expansive in a sense, but also he sees them and he reproduces them. So I'm thinking that when you are doing bird watching,
Mhm.
are you, because your poems are so visual,
Mhm.
how does it work for you? Do you remember that place? Do you remember the thing and you write, or you while you're seeing them, some of it's going on in your head?
See, bird watching is note taking as well, right?
Yeah,
Because for identification, etc. Even though these are actually two contrary: bird watching, bird photography, and the act of writing poetry. I feel that these are two contrary pulls inside me. Even gardening, I feel, is contrary to bird watching. And on the one hand, I'm kind of connected to the soil and fixed in a place. It's very difficult to move away when you're gardening. It's like a lot of thought has to go into who is going to take care of the plants, who is going to water the plants when I'm away. On the other hand, bird watching is constant movement, constant shifting. And in a way, one has to follow the birds because they don't stay still. So these are kind of contrary pulls I feel in me. And also because in my bird watching, I feel that in spite of my in spite of my issues with, say, the creamy background, etc., and trying to picture the habitat as a whole, maybe look at the messiness of the image rather than look at the cleanliness of it. Even then, I feel that there is a desire to pin down things, which is something that I don't feel, I don't need, I don't want it in my poetry.
yeah,
I move towards this kind of haziness and that kind of blurring of the edges that you see in Turner's paintings.
yeah, yeah,
Whereas when I'm photographing a bird, I do want to know the name of the bird. I do want to know. I do want to rationalize
Yeah.
what I have seen, which is why I say, this creates certain kinds of conflicts within me, and also in my process of looking at the bird, trying to bring the bird into some kind of representation, maybe poetry, maybe a photograph. But then this representation is also so dangerous, right? I don't really know what I'm trying to do in this act of representation.
So the
Sometimes
poem is your true representation, the more than the photograph, the affective.
I can't answer, Ravi. That's an impossible.
Because one of the ways in which we know the other
Mm,
is through the affective way, through literature, poetry, visual arts, which creates another kind of sensibility, I feel, which is not really evidentiary in the way we know what evidence means,
yeah.
but it brings out other sensibilities, which is actually more comprehensively the way we know something.
Yeah,
You know?
definitely. In a way, when I'm thinking about words, I'm not really concerned about meaning so much,
Yeah.
and I don't really care actually. I mean, as a teacher, perhaps,
Yeah.
but not in my other
Yeah.
spaces that I occupy. Maybe even as a teacher, I don't really care most of the time, and maybe because I came to bird watching so late, like just a little more than a decade ago, and also because it is controlled by a very, I would say, a kind of masculine. It's a masculine space, and it's difficult to dismantle the kind of masculinity that one sees in that particular space. I have tried. I have this whole series of bird photographs. It's called the bird blur. The bird blur is actually my attempt to try and question that fixity of the image, that kind of knowability of the bird that bird photographers are usually involved in. It's an attempt to escape that, which is something that I don't really think about so much, because it's the way I've always thought about poetry. I mean, I don't really think about it. It's there. I don't want to use the word natural, but that's the way
It is.
I engage with poetry. But that's not the way I engage with bird photography, which is why I used the word conflict earlier. But then also because it's also something that I try to question, think through, escape from. There are possibilities in this escape, I think. And I think my bird blur images are a way of questioning that.
So, if I may just prod you a little more about your use of the term masculine space, because it really links up with my idea of othering something, of how othering happens, and to rupture this idea of what human is, in a sense that there is one human or one. So, would you like to say a bit more about what is this masculine space which bird watching occupies, which you feel?
It's what you had said, this colonial thing about maybe taxonomy, maybe getting to know the name, IDing the bird, focusing on the bird, expensive lenses. These are all interconnected, I feel.
That's
And
right.
also, not only this, it's also about how a lot of this conservationists, they call themselves conservationists, and if you look at the way they have, several of them have actually looked at indigenous practices in the Northeast, for instance. I would say it kind of replicates certain types of colonial agendas. I feel, it's like, I'm the do-gooder here. I'm trying to conserve your land for you. Your practices are backward. I've seen this a lot, especially in bird conservation efforts in the Northeast. And because a lot of the conservationists are outsiders who are not really aware of the histories of the space, or the way particular birds are seen in that cultural milieu, etc. I can't really tell you exactly how this works, but this is the way it's been happening for quite some time now. But now, maybe in the last 2-3 years, I've seen a change. I think more sensitive now, more compassionate, more aware of the other, and not just going there trampling all over people and saying, oh, whatever we are saying is right and whatever we are doing is right. It's very interesting actually, because when I saw this happening, I think I saw this in discussions, in group discussions, in bird watching group discussions, even among conservationists. It was interesting. I was also quite scandalized actually, to tell you the truth, because the kind of language that was used, that we are the educated, we are the civilized, we have to teach, etc. It's interesting.
Like a classic nature culture divide. The knowledge from the understanding what the relationships are there. I mean, the idea that nature is a produced thing. Doesn't exist outside its production. You produce nature through your interaction and relationship with it. And there's no fixed idea of what nature is. So by you're almost producing an idea of what the bird is when you are engaging with it through your poems, maybe, you're repositioning what that bird is in a sense.
Uh-huh. Actually, because you asked this question about, what does this masculine space mean?
Yeah.
Also,
I understand. Yeah.
Also about, how does this othering take place? And this othering takes place not just in, forcing a kind of representation on the bird, because you see, there is this thing about rationality, right? Rationality, and this whole thing about taxonomy, and not just that. It's also very simple. Like if you're going bird watching with a group of people, there would be, someone with authority, someone who will say, who would know everything, someone who will control everything, and the kind of authority figure, very very patriarchal authority figure who will control everything. This is a simple, banal kind of an example, but but that's the way it works, even at a microcosmic level, I feel. And people who know all the rules, people who know how to ID the birds, people who know how to photograph them well, somehow it comes from this space of, I would say, privilege, also class privilege, maybe even caste privilege.
Yes.
They definitely have the money to buy the prime lenses, and also to travel for bird photography. Need to travel a lot and costs money, because you just have the money to go wherever you want to go, not really care about the people who stay there, the people who live there. It's just like almost like an encroachment.
Yeah. I totally understand. And I've been thinking and talking about this. When I said nature is produced, I also meant the location through which nature is produced. And that is a location of personal location. So of gender, of class, of caste.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like Mukul Sharma writes about nature in green and caste. And he talks about how the Dalit view of nature is very different than what you might imagine, in a sense. So the production of nature becomes an abstraction of it, and the abstraction of it is further removed from what you're doing because of your privilege. So the further you are, the more abstract you're going to be, the more aesthetic it's going to be, in a sense, and the more creamy layered the background needs to be, in a sense, to be, it perpetuates and accentuates that abstraction, which actually is not a. And I was a bird watcher. I don't know if you know. I was a bird watcher
I know
15 years, and I totally know what that means. It meant going, in a group and with notes, and you end up with great knowledge about the characteristics, colors, markings, so-called habits of birds, but very little connection with anything else. You have very little connection with other landscapes, other connections, other than just this. It's a checklist, which you end up doing. And bird photography actually becomes even a further, because when you do bird photography, you can't do very much else because you're carrying these big lenses and you stand there for hours. So just in terms of occupation of time and space, that's what you do. There's nothing else you could. So you have to have that very focused mind frame through which you do it. And I think I've started I questioned this a long time back in terms of what am I doing, doing this, and it's also led me away from bird photography and wildlife watching many decades back, because I felt that it became like sorry to use the word, the National Geographic view of nature, in a sense, where you watch it as an outsider, in a sense, and you think you know it, but actually know nothing about it. And so I'm very interested in how nature is produced from different political vantage point. A person from the indigenous community produces very different ideas of nature, relationship-wise. And those habits, those productions are actually deeply rooted in values of a different sort. Their values of reciprocity and, humility, rather than of telling you something. And that's been the old anthropological problem as well, in a sense of going and observing something and bringing it back as the exotic. And that's a classic kind of thing. So, but I feel that, I think I read somewhere, and I read some of your poems also, that you also touch on this in your metaphors of caste and class in your poems. And also you've been described as a feminist poet as well. And I'm really interested in these political positions.
I use the word feminist now with caution.
Yeah. That's why I also used it with caution. I said you've been described as one, so I didn't want to claim that you do the same thing yourself. But I'm interested in these different positions through which the otherness becomes something else. And I think a lot of the multi-species world ideas which we have to overcome is to overcome these structures of positions of privilege and power which create this otherness, these alienations, in a sense. And I think your poem does that very beautifully in many ways, because you get a different sense, different feel of something, of gardening or of poetry, of birds, or whatever you're writing about.
It's there very clearly in the title poem Crowbite, in my new book, which came out last year. So it's there in Crowbite. But it's there in my earlier work as well. It's just that I don't think the critics noticed it or read my poems in that way. But Crowbite, I think it's very obvious. I've made it obvious in that.
Would you like to read it?
No, it's like I told you.
Bit of it.
No, it's really long. Actually.
I know, yeah.
Crowbite is really long. People think it's a short story.
But what I'm interested in our conversation and in conversations with people like you is to also reread some of these practices in the nature question, which is what I'm trying to do, with you. Because I think there's, of course, the literary part of you, which is read in literature, English literature and poetry. But I think also this rereads them in the nature question of what sensibilities can be evoked through people like you in reducing the otherness.
Yeah, exactly.
And so anything you want to say about your position in this, even if you don't want to read a poem, but anything about your positions or what you think about these positions of caste, class, privilege. You said something about it, but what do you feel about it? Because I think you have very political positions.
No, I think my position comes very clearly from where I was born. I was born into a Dalit family. And that's why the river is so important, fishing community. That's my past, that's my ancestry. And which is why, I think about it. I think about the river, but also I also think about caste when I think about the river, which is why critical nostalgia. And I think it comes across in my earlier work as well. If you read a poem like Matsagandha, even though it's not really about the Northeast or about Assam or about the Brahmaputra. It's clearly about being othered. It's clearly about being a woman who is lowly. And I think all my work actually tries to work around this question of how am I to figure this out through all my practices actually, whatever I do, my teaching, my gardening, everything, it revolves around this question of identity actually, and also about questions of historical othering and of loss of lack of privilege rather. And I think that's what informs everything that I do, even though, like I said, critics haven't really seen it or have not really read that into my work. But that's where I come from.
And I think
said it in so many words now.
No, right. And I think it's a good thing you don't make your identity obvious in your description of yourself. Some people do. You don't, and you expect people to read it in your work in a sense, because you as a critic don't. So unless you tell it like this, like I didn't know this, what you just told me, and so I think it's a compliment to you as a person to let that underlie rather than guide somebody to read something.
I don't know. I actually totally believe too in the fact that you have to claim your identity. And also,
but there's so many ways of claiming identity.
Yeah, I think that's a way of doing it. I mean that's good too. I totally support this claiming of your identity and using it to write the way you want to write, and or do whatever you want, not just write. It's just that I don't know. I never really thought about it in that way, but I welcome it actually. I welcome this reading of my work.
Yeah. And so just one more thing I'd like to ask you, that when we think of the nature question, and I think the nature question is about the othering, the alienation. At its core, I think the problem of nature is the problem of alienation. And it's a philosophical and ethical question as well as a political one, in a sense. So it encompasses many spheres of ourselves, many spheres of our structures of society, but many spheres of our personal selves and selfhoods as well, in a sense. So it's a very complex question, but it's a radical question, I think. So it's a question which I want to ask you through your experience of your own life, your own identity, and your own work, and your very conscious work. It's a very conscious and sort of very aware practice as a poet. Do you think some of the future ideas of overcoming this otherness lies in these positional evocation of different kinds of sensing and sensibilities about nature, which cannot be done from the outside, but have to be done from inside those positions? You cannot just project it as something. You have to, from inside, you have to go out, if you know what I mean, if I'm making any sense. A grounded view, a lived view.
Yes, I do believe, at least in my academic understanding of things, I believe in the experiential quality of what you do. I think what I meant was that there is this person that you are, and this personhood that you possess, and you also go through certain experiences of your life, certain experiential realities that only you are aware of because of your particular positionality. And I think that really ought to feed into how you respond to knowledge formations, of how you look at the world around you, including nature, and also, of course, look at things from the space of privilege and non-privilege. And also, I actually believe that it has to come from, I don't know about internal, external, but somehow, this world that you inhabit, you are marked by it.
Right.
You're marked by it, and that those markers will be visible in whatever you do, in at least most of the things that you do. Those markers as wounds, as whatever, this kind of punctum, it punctures you, and it may be visible in whatever want to create again, big word.
Yeah, by internal, external, I meant that what you just said, that as a lived, something you experienced, and then through which you know something differently, in a sense.
Also, if I think about it photographically, again, something that I've been thinking about for a while now, because the lens actually brings the bird too close. And, is that the way the eye sees? The eye doesn't see in this monumental way, that the thing is magnified so many times. And so how do we go back to this, what I called once, I think, this innocent seeing, which is also distant seeing because it's so far away from you. And what does looking too close, when something is too close to you, even though it's actually not close to you, the lens makes it seem like, it's close to you. And this is something, it's still a hazy thought in my mind, but I've been trying to excavate it. What does it mean to bring something such proximity? What does such proximity mean? And
yeah,
would
I think
distance be better?
Yeah, I think Susan Sontag, on her essay on photography, she wrote centuries back, writes about the gaze and the male gaze, which the camera brings, and I think, and I think that's very much built into this idea of it's almost intrusive and voyeuristic in a sense, and I think a totally different aesthetic of the image would have a totally different approach. It won't be. It could be a approach of a totally different visual form in a sense, not one image, but so many different images, or so many different strategies and techniques you need to use about, and maybe a mixture of poems and images and writing to visualize what that relationship is. And I think decolonizing the gaze is very much part of unothering, or whatever. I just invented that word, but in a sense. So that's great, Nitoo. Thank you so much. If there's something, I've been doing all the questioning, it's really not fair, but if you want to ask me something, you're free to.
What do you plan to do actually? What is the plan?
So I want to, because this idea of multi-species world is an idea where there's a shift of agency from there's an idea of coexistence and co-evolution and co-forming. And there's no one thought about it. There's not one way we can do it. There's so many different thoughts. And of course, the academia has a certain language, but I think the artist has another language, and the activist has a third language, in a sense. So there's a website which it's under development.
I saw it's under construction.
Yeah, every artist will get, every participant, and right now I have about 25 participants. I have planned about 25 participants from all over the world, and they will get a page each. And if you want to contribute something on the page, it'll be your page, in a sense. So when you go on there, you can send me any material you want to with full acknowledgement. It'll be your page with this interview at the center, and all.
I'll send you my bird blurs, images.
It'll be great. I will so welcome it. But also then it becomes a way in which you open up this question. My idea is only to explore this question into wherever it takes. So it's a growing sets of conversations of putting different lenses on the same question from different perspectives.
Very exciting. It's large. I mean, you have so the way you imagine it. I think it's quite large.
Because I believe the only way we can move forward in this question of alienation, because we're so locked in it right now, and so structurally we are so locked in it, institutionally we are so locked in it, is to reimagine it. And reimagining is not a singular exercise. Reimagining is to me, a political act of explosions and implosions. And that's the way I see these. I see these ways of interrogating the political structures through different voices.
very exciting.
Thank
I'm
you so
looking
much.
for this.
Thank you.